Long gone are the days when Filipinos talk about the United States as the gold standard. In fact, one thing that is very popular nowadays is for Filipinos to say, walang ganyan sa Singapore. There's no such thing in Singapore. Lots of reverence for Singapore, lots of admiration for what the city-state has achieved over the past half a century. But we have to also understand the story of Singapore when it comes to its national security, when it comes to defending itself, and what are the lessons for other countries like the Philippines. For that, we have a very special guest. Colin, thank you very much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. A lot to discuss here. Um, First of all, for the purpose of our audience, because Singapore is obviously a country that everyone talks about, and really from point of reverence and admiration, and for good reason, right? No country is perfect. Obviously, we can talk about a lot of issues, but one of the things that people appreciate about Singapore is the at least relatively
Mm,
more coherent, forward, if not long-term looking
mm,
approach when it comes to its
mm,
strategic culture.
mm,
Can you tell me about Singapore's strategic culture
mm,
as a Chinese, ethnic Chinese majority country?
mm,
That unique attribute you have.
Yes, I think the most straightforward aspect of the strategic culture has always been the geographical size, right? That the country is small, and you look at the neighborhood, it is being surrounded by bigger neighbors like Indonesia, Malaysia, with whom we have our own set of problems historically. Not all of them were resolved even till today, and that I think forms a big part uh, of our strategic culture, which
Right.
is official, right? But I often like to say that we also have a grassroots level of strategic culture, which I think is in some ways very reflective in our
Mhm.
government policy. Is also what we call being afraid to lose, right? In Hokkien, we use it in Hokkien, it's called kiasu, right?
Right.
If kiasu is a type of strategic culture, it relates to the idea of siege mentality, right?
Right. That you
When
are threatened by your neighbors, bigger
yeah,
neighbors, and
yeah,
all that. Yeah.
threatened by your bigger neighbor. That is more geopolitical, right?
Yeah.
But at the societal level, there's always the endless concern about okay, what if I lag behind my friends, my relatives.
Mm.
I have my neighbor who sends his kid to an elite school, and what should my kid go? Where should he go? Right.
Right.
So there is this so-called rat race, right? But in a way, we engage in our own rat race. There is a constant struggle to try to not just compete, but at least be up to par. That has been, I think, another way to look at our strategic culture that we see as reflective of Singapore's broader political perspective of the siege mentality.
Right.
But I have to say, in the more recent times, at the societal level, I mean, due to the advent of globalization, social media, I think that kiasuness has started to sort of
Taper off.
taper off.
Mm.
That's a good way to put it. Or rather, younger Singaporeans started to take it in a more relaxed manner,
Mm.
I think.
Because
But
you're such a advanced, powerful country compared to before.
maybe, but
Mm.
there's also one concern, which again might have implications of strategic culture, is that because Singaporeans today are born in an era that hasn't seen hardship.
Mm.
So things just come so easily. Education comes easily. As you know, Singapore is largely a paternalistic
Of
society.
course.
The governance style is paternalistic, right? So
Takes
everything,
care of all the
yeah,
basics, socialized housing, healthcare.
yeah,
Yeah.
everything. Just fill the forms, for example, and you get the needed services and whatnot. And I guess Singaporeans, I mean the younger ones, started to settle into a very comfortable mode and has started to relax a little bit. And of course, that's good in the sense that it advances the society, right? That the society is no longer kiasu or so
Yeah.
kiasu, right? There's more to kiasuness in life. But on the other hand, I mean, for me who studies this field,
Right.
there is a concern that Singaporeans might have taken the peace and the comfort for granted,
Right.
which may have a downstream impact on how Singapore as a society is able to deal with future crises. Are we resilient enough? Because if we look at the hard power perspective, we have
Right.
economic power, of course. We have military power. We have diplomatic power. But when it comes to resilience, it's a very broadly encompassing thing, right? You can have all these hard power aspects, but if the society is
Right.
weak and not resilient enough, in the psychological sense, that is problematic.
So the capacity of the building is there in terms of having the most advanced aircrafts
Mm,
and all, but capabilities
mm,
in terms of human capital, in
mm,
terms of the right psychology and preparedness, you
mm.
think that's not there, and that's the price you pay for prosperity and peace
In a
for a
way,
quarter century, right?
yes. Yeah, but you see, as you are very well familiar with, it's about deterrence, right? That
Sure.
you need to be credible, you need to show your capability, you need to communicate. We have done all three. But then the question that I always try to grapple with is, if that is peacetime, if there's a crisis,
Right.
are we able to rally and mobilize the people to fight for the cause? And then will we reach a point where people start to question what is the cause, right? One thing is we are a multiracial, multi-religious society,
Right.
and we have people who come from all over the world. We are a melting pot, essentially. To build the identity is important. We have always been talking about nation building, even to this day. I receive my income tax letter every now and then. You know, at the back of the letter of the envelope, there's always been thank you for contribution to nation building. I was like, okay,
Right.
so nation building, but what is nation, right? And we ask a question, national identity. The question that I ask my students in class, whether it is my military students or the students in RSIS, the question I ask is, how do you define identity, right? What is national identity?
Right.
Say chili crab, identity, right? Speaking Singlish is identity.
Right.
But then again, the question is, you know, if locally born Singaporeans are able to identify themselves around that, what was the case of, say, naturalized citizens
Right.
outside? We are, after all, a melting pot. We are a country that has been facing an aging population with a very low total fertility rate. So we do need immigrants to come in, and that poses a complex question. How do we assimilate them and make them feel at home?
Right.
Make them feel that their home is Singapore and not elsewhere. They don't pledge allegiance elsewhere. If there is a crisis in the future, will
Yes.
they be loyal to Singapore?
Mm.
Will they actually, if need be, fight for Singapore?
The patriotic spirit. You want to
Yes.
instill the patriotic spirit.
Indeed, that is, I think, a very complex question that I believe our policymakers are still trying to figure out.
Doesn't the mandatory military service for Singapore-born ones, instill enough of patriotism after you spend all that time in the military?
Yes, I mean, I served in the national service before.
Exactly.
The one thing that I thought is the greatest takeaway wasn't so much the patriotism part. It's the friendships that you created, right? The
Camaraderie. Yeah.
there's camaraderie, the rapport that you build. And I think that is a good aspect of nation building, because when you serve in one military unit, it came from all over the place,
Right.
for all walks of society, various races, various religions,
Right.
all come together as one, and we sort of share our lives with each other and all that. That's the biggest, greatest takeaway. But then, of course, I do understand, hearing from those of my colleagues in the military. Yes, in the more recent times, there are very interesting cases where you see a Caucasian-looking
Right.
person who is a Singaporean,
Yes. Yes.
who is the commander of a platoon,
Oh wow.
for example.
Interesting.
It is.
So these are the children of the naturalized ones.
Yes.
From the Western world.
Yes.
Interesting.
So say, for example, let's put a benchmark. My grandfather might be termed as a first generation Singaporean,
Yeah.
because he migrated from China, and then they sort of lived through the
Yeah.
British colonial times and Japanese colonial times. And then my parents were born, say around the Second World War, and
Yeah.
right after will be second gen. I'm the third gen. For these, they will be of the later gen,
Right.
And some of their parents came as the third gen or the fourth gen. So then after that, their children grow up, and then if they choose to serve their national service, which of course is great, I do hear of cases where they decide to go back to their own country of origin because they
Right.
don't want to serve NS, right? But we do have, of course, quite a substantial, from what I know, a substantial bulk of these naturalized citizens who actually call Singapore their home, and they even encourage their offspring, I mean, of course, their sons, to serve the national service, which sometimes stands in contrast to even locally born Singaporeans who are trying to evade
Right.
to serve.
Which is normal across many countries with mandatory. I mean,
Yeah,
I hear that
yeah.
in South Korea. I hear
South
that in other
Korea,
countries. Yeah.
Taiwan,
Exactly.
those with conscript military, they often have this sort of issue
Russia. Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always been another bigger question in Singapore related to that is whether our existing system is able to contain and accommodate the growing and evolving aspiration of younger Singaporeans.
Right.
Right. We have this debate about Singaporeans who believe that they should be given the opportunity to develop themselves individually. For example, be given a chance to represent the country in national and international sports events, right? So NS shouldn't be the first thing they should do. They should go and serve national service. The government has a policy of so-called NS deferment on the case-by-case basis.
So they can defer the military service.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the unfortunate
Let's say
thing,
you're Olympic star or something. Yeah.
for example, but not all of them will have that sort of
course. That's the
deferment.
elite of the elite. Yeah.
Maybe. And sometimes because how could you justify that you deserve the deferment unless you're able to showcase your potential?
Right.
So what if your potential doesn't come across as so obvious at the beginning, and the government says that no way, I'm not going to let you defer, and thereafter find yourself in some sort of a dilemma. Should I stay on and serve my NS, and then I sort of miss the golden years
for creativity, the halcyon days of your youth and creativity? Yes. I understand. Yeah.
Especially for those in the sports sector, right?
Yes.
I mean, they have a shelf life.
Yeah, that 2 years is long in terms. That could be your peak year for your gold medal. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it just turns out that your prime year, that you will develop yourself to your fullest potential in sports, coincides with the prime years of you going into NS.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
So I mean, because ultimately, if you serve NS, you have all the attributes that are required that's similar to sports.
I mean, what about like South Korea is a very high-performing society in terms of creativity, in terms of arts and sports.
Yeah.
Isn't there some inspiration from there? Although I know it's also controversial, the BTS case and some of these idols, right?
Yes, of course, of course. I mean, firstly, we don't have such a large population like South Korea. That's one. And of course, they are way more homogeneous as a society than our case, which of course created some challenges for us. Being a small country, and you have to bear in mind that there is a need to maintain a critical mass of manpower that could respond to any national security contingency. So there must be a way for it to maintain. But what I do understand that we are facing a shrinking population. And by the account, it also means that the armed forces is going to shrink. And so the bigger question, which is all-time favorite question that we have for every batches of young military officers that we interact with, was that, how do you make sure that, the armed forces is able to evolve according to the times, right? Shrinking manpower, and a never-ending array of things that you are required to do because there's so much security issues.
Right.
So because of that, how do we best optimize the manpower? How do we optimize manpower and interface it effectively with high tech, for example?
Right.
And then the question has always been, do you rely only on that? Because for some contingencies, you do need manpower. Look at Ukraine, right? End of the day, if you cannot guarantee that the conflict is going to end in, say, a few days, it's going to be a protracted conflict. How are you going to last that? How are you going to sustain that? You need manpower. In a way, quantity is.
But can't the manpower issue be dealt with, like, for instance, the IDF, women also do their military service? Is that an issue that literally you solve the manpower by bringing the women?
Yeah, I was impressed when I was in Tel Aviv some years back, and I saw very young female soldiers. They are shorter than me, and they're lugging assault rifles that are almost the length of their body.
Yeah.
That was impressive. And of course, these women personnel are still serving on the front line. I mean, look at the case, for example, of the strike on Iran just recently. Some of those fighter pilots were actually women. So that was impressive.
So
As
maybe
a
that could be
country,
a model for other in terms of bringing women into the national service.
yes, but you see,
Different
here,
culture, I suppose. Yeah.
we had, I believe we had that sort of debate before. I believe this has been studied before as well. Then the question is, if you have to put almost the entire population under,
Who's
right?
the backward linkage? Yes,
Yeah,
who's gonna take care of the family and
yeah,
I
the
see what you're saying.
family,
Yeah,
and I think more importantly, I think there's the biggest concern is the economy.
economy.
Who is going to run the economy?
Yeah, you have
And
very successful women managers and
yes, okay. Look, for example, um, my female peers born in the same year will be 2 years ahead of me.
because they didn't serve the national service.
Yes. So there's always been these growls I hear.
I understand.
That,
Yeah.
oh, we are 2 years behind them and all that. So it might be better for them to be like us. Okay, that sounds very petty to me because she's very short-sighted. If the idea here is a very spiteful idea that okay, just because it's unfair, so you want them to serve, I don't think that is a valid reason, right? There must be a clear study that is done to lay out the pros and cons of involving women in a real universal conscription framework. If there is no necessity for that, then we shouldn't go into that. If we are able to make do with the manpower constraints with technology, then we should still tap on technology first. Tapping on a much wider pool of manpower like women shouldn't be the first resort. I'm not foreclosing it, but the way I see as an academic looking at these issues,
absolutely, yeah.
I think it is a possibility that we cannot dismiss.
Yeah,
going forward.
The reason I'm asking, it keeps on popping up in podcast conversations from Singapore and so I'm sorry if I have to put you on the spot, but I'm not sorry for raising that. Obviously, we're going to talk about the national identity issue, especially with things that Ambassador Costigan and all, the whole influence operation, United Front issue. But before going there, can we expound on this concept of anticipatory strategic culture, this idea of you're constantly trying to anticipate what's the next crisis, and more importantly also this forward defense strategy of Singapore. You don't wait for the trouble to come to you. You make sure you already have cushion, certain strategic layers of cushion. Can you expound on that? Is this something that can only work for an advanced small sized country like Singapore, or are there also lessons for more medium sized countries like the Philippines, for instance?
Well, in this case, there are a host of differences, right?
Of course, yeah.
The Philippines is an archipelagic nation. We are surrounded by water. We are surrounded by water, but to the north is just a small strip of water in that. If the water space is wide enough, maybe Singapore could have avoided the fate back in 1941, right? When the Japanese took a lightning assault all the way down the peninsula, it took them just a few weeks.
Just like that, yeah.
Which go against simply the British assessment that it will take them months to do that, but they did it in many times faster. In that, we have a lack of strategic depth, which is a reality, right? Now, the forward defense thing, of course, came about informed by history, right? Of course, the Japanese invasion from Peninsula Malaya back then, and of course southern Thailand, has a great part to play in that strategic culture, right? That you need to have forward defense. But the question is now, we rely quite significantly on the heartlands of Malaysia for much of our food security, right?
Water, including, yeah, exactly.
Food,
oil, even, and I heard a lot of Singaporeans go across and then they come back at cheaper because I heard a lot. Yeah.
But now that the Awak government is clamping down on the sale of subsidized petrol, I think
smuggling.
It will reduce the allure of Johor to Singaporean drivers. But we still have people going there for shopping because they say it's 3 times cheaper, right? For groceries and all that. But look, say for example, in a hypothetical scenario where we actually enter into a war with Malaysia, and if you read Tim Huxley's book, Defending Lion City, he laid out that scenario pretty vividly. Of course, I recommend David Boy's book, which is a fiction book, but I think it's worth to read to sort of frame our understanding of how it will turn out. Look, we are a small country, and it doesn't benefit us if we engage in any prolonged conflict with our neighbors. Look, say if you go by Tim Huxley's scenario of, say, an attack all the way up to Mersing, or they call it Mersing Line, which is supposedly where the postulated reservoirs are located, and so therefore you secure up to that line.
Right.
Look, we will have our hands full when it comes to the entire problem with, say, guerrilla warfare and all that. Are we going to just expect Malaysians to sit there and just be happy with it? No. They are a larger country. If their country is being under attack, I believe they will try to fight back, right? And we'll find ourselves in a certain conundrum. I'm speaking of this from an academic perspective. It doesn't reflect any government position, but honestly, it doesn't pay for us if we engage in a conflict like that. So even if we have to have a forward defense strategy, in peacetime, it serves a deterrent purpose. But in actual conflict scenario, there is a big question as to whether it is feasible. And whether or not we could dictate all the terms as to how long we want the entire campaign to be prosecuted. It may not be up to us, end of the day. So therefore, there are a host of other operational and strategic issues that has to be talked about.
Can we widen the aperture a little bit? I mean, you just acquired quite an advanced German submarine. You have F-35 fighters, the only one in this part of this world. What is forward defense in operational terms? The ability to preemptively strike, the offensive capability of other countries, is that part of it when you talk about forward defense?
It is part of it.
Yeah.
We will consider that the war is lost if the enemy has been able to come to our doorstep.
Right.
So if need be, it has to be preemptive. It has to be anticipatory.
Right.
If it means striking first, I think that is something that isn't being taken out of the entire equation.
Right.
If need be. And which is the reason why we acquire force projection capabilities to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? Jet fighters with considerable range and payload, mid-air refueling aircraft, and of course we have a long-range precision guided munitions as well, and all that. And our ships, the Navy in particular, I look at maritime security. The Navy is designed for green water operation.
Right.
And it's not a brown water Navy.
Right. It's region-wide.
It's a region. So if need be, it will operate all the way out in the South China Sea. It will operate to the west.
Right. Indian Ocean, way into the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, even the Bay of Bengal, for example.
Wow. Incredible.
So, I mean, there must be a reason why all these capabilities are acquired. If all you need is a brown water Navy, then you don't need a submarine like that.
Just immediate.
Yeah, you don't need to buy frigates, right? All you need is just simply stick with the old Cold War conception of how we built the Navy to begin with. Fast attack craft, patrol craft, that's it. We acquire frigates, larger vessels coming online. It's precisely because they're designed for force projection.
Right.
If need be, we have to safeguard sea of communications far away from Singapore shore.
Considering you're a trading hub, I mean, your economy is basically about exports and processing all of products. Yeah.
Say, for example, we wouldn't envisage a scenario where the enemy, whichever enemy you can think about, is going to blockade Singapore just by simply massing ships along our coast.
I see.
First of all, is our waters are not exactly very expensive to begin with, and of course, it makes them more vulnerable.
Yeah.
All we need will be just shore-based missiles to hit them, right? But in this case, we are anticipating more than that. It's not a close blockade, for example. It could be a case of a distant blockade.
Right.
That may actually become a problem for us. So when we take part in the counter-piracy operations in around 2008, 2009, we send a frigate
to Horn of Africa.
Horn Africa. Simply, it's not just to show that we are relevant to the international society, not just to show that we are trying to uphold the rule of law and all that. We are also trying to showcase our ability to project force.
Yeah, and protect sea lanes of communication way beyond your immediate waters.
Exactly. I mean, there's a hidden, sort of a hidden message that we are trying to send across, that we have the ability to safeguard our interests this far. If we need to send our force projection capabilities this far, we will do that. So that is, I think, one key difference that
Mhm.
I think sort of distinguishes between Singapore
And
and
most of your neighbors,
yeah,
not only the Philippines.
yeah,
I want to pick your mind on where the Philippines should go in terms of maritime security,
mm,
but just to end on the Singapore part,
mm,
at least for this discussion, what is this United Front influence operation discourse that's coming out quite openly?
mm,
You have, we talked about Bilahari Kosikan. We talked about a lot of thought leaders across the region. Washington Post and New York Times have had a lot of
yeah,
reports about this. You are a ethnic Chinese majority country,
yeah,
despite, of course, you're cosmopolitan, you're
mm,
multilingual.
mm,
Yes, but at the same time, it looks like there is a perception, at least some in mainland China, that after all, you are the extension of the motherland. Can you tell me a little bit about this? I know this is a very sensitive issue, but
mm,
to the degree that we can discuss it, yeah.
yeah. Of course, I will say it from the perspective of an academic who has been looking at these issues. Um, the government certainly conducts its own studies on that. I believe Washington Post sort of quoted one study from the
Yeah.
government that showed that majority Singaporeans are sort of loyal to the country itself. Now, this consciousness started to become much more prominent
Yeah.
after 2016, and that has something to do with the Philippines actually, right?
Right.
With the arbitral award that came out in the run up to that, there has been quite a bit of I would say narratives that were being floated in the Singapore media, for example, that seem to highlight a certain inclination towards supporting the Chinese position, largely in the Chinese media, of course. And that is where largely the narrative started to go around. Because I remember having spoken to my father, uh, he he wasn't that well educated, honestly. He wasn't so well educated, and he has a more limited source of information.
Yeah, the information ecosystem is quite different. Yeah.
Very, very different. So he might potentially take this particular reporting as gospel, right?
Yeah.
They say, oh yeah, this is a position that is correct. He may not consider other thing else. To be honest, this is quite um, emblematic
Yeah.
of the Singapore society as such. When we look at this issue about, say, United Front influence operations and all that. Now, Singapore, if you want to understand the way all these are being perceived, is that it depends on who you are speaking to. If you are speaking to the older generation of Singaporeans, especially ethnic Chinese, older
Mm,
generation of
yeah.
Singaporeans, uh, they actually could have a much greater affinity towards, say, the PRC.
Is there some emotional element, this element of remembering Western colonialism,
Yes.
mistreatment in the past?
Yeah.
Because this
Yeah.
is what I also get from Chinese Filipinos,
Yep.
older
Yep.
generation,
Yep.
who have similar stories of they don't believe Western news media. It's,
Yeah.
what I'm saying, and they're proud that China has become a global power.
Yes. Yes. To some extent.
Mm,
And there is also this, um, what I believe to be the case is, for example, these second gen Singaporeans, my parents' generation, so they listen and they hear a lot about China
yeah.
from their parents, who are my grandparents, right? So my
Yeah.
grandparents, they will be the most wedded to the country of origin back then. For example, my paternal grandfather, after the Second World War, not long after, he decided that he wanted to go back to China. So
Oh.
he actually went back to Fujian,
Yeah.
interestingly, during the time of the Cultural Revolution,
Oh.
which is
Oh yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I heard a lot of Indonesian Chinese also when
Yeah, which is ironic because it was a time in China that was so messy.
not the best times. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
people in China wanted to come out, but he wanted
yeah.
to go back
Yeah.
because he missed home. So
Yeah.
he went back, he passed away there, and he was buried there.
Hmm.
But you see, those sort of stories that they sort of pass down, it stops somewhere. My parents wouldn't tell me the same stories. And even if they tell me the same stories, I don't feel the connection at all,
Right.
for example. So likewise, my parents who are born here, they may know that, okay, because my father come from China. So to some extent, there is this sort of a default
Yeah.
cultural affinity to China, right? And of course, added to the fact that, for example, my grandfather is now buried in Fujian. So
Yes.
every year during the Hungry Ghost Festival, we go back to pay respects, for example. So there is this affinity.
And there are also this PRC organize going back to your roots campaigns, right?
There
Reaching
is.
out to the younger generation, right? Yeah.
There is, and of course, there is also not forgetting the role played by the so-called Chinese clan associations in Singapore.
Right.
The what they call the Teochew Clan
Teochew, yeah.
Association, Hakka Clan Association. I mean, largely they revolve around business,
Sure.
and they serve as pretty powerful business lobbies when it comes to dealing with China. They serve like a go-between
Right.
between the government and their Chinese interlocutors, right? In terms of economic lobbying and political lobbying for
And
certain-
legitimate cultural exchange.
Yeah,
You know, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I think this has become more prominent, especially after Singapore made a statement about the arbitral award.
Right.
It was, if you look at the statement, it was, there was nothing really wrong about it.
Yeah,
right?
it was very neutral, I
Very
would say.
neutral.
Yeah.
We only say we took note of the award.
Right.
We didn't say that we support whoever, but we
Yeah.
took note of the award. And a
Is
string
this
of
also
example-
the speech of the former prime minister in the Council on Foreign Relations in particular? Was that the one that triggered some? Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, after that, with regard to our security ties with Taiwan, for example,
Right.
and then a string of issues happened thereafter. The sort of angry exchange
Right.
of communications.
So before that, China was okay that you had these regular drills in Taiwan, which is what most people don't know about, right?
No, okay,
And then they suddenly get your armored vehicles and all of that confiscated.
okay. Honestly, I would say that before Xi Jinping came to power, things like that became much better controlled. And of course, it very much depends on how cross-strait relations evolve. For
Right.
example, back in the early 2000s, then he wasn't yet Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. He went to China. No, he went to Taiwan for a visit, and it was
Because he was not the prime minister yet, so it didn't
yeah,
create
so
stir.
he
Yeah.
went in. So it didn't sit down well in China, but it didn't help that the Taiwanese media as well as the politicians then,
Of course, played it up. Yeah.
it was under the first DPP government, Chen
Sure.
Shui-bian. He was the first non-KMT president. who
A very
came to power.
vivacious politician, I would
Yes,
say. Yeah.
yes. So during that time, cross-strait relations were on the very low, right? And it somehow affected us. I mean, say for example, if it is outside that occasion, such visits to Taiwan wouldn't have been picked up. It'd be made
Right.
a big deal.
Right.
But under such circumstance, in a way, we find ourselves in the crosshairs. Just because we are trying to sort of maintain ties with both sides of the
Yeah.
straits. And then thereafter, things sort of died down, especially during Ma Ying-jeou's administration. But I have to say that Xi Jinping came into power and he has a very different sort of
So
orientation.
both
to that.
Xi Jinping and also the return of DPP after
Yes.
2015, plus the West Philippine Sea South China Sea issue, all came together to
All came
conspire
together.
to make things a little bit more tense than usual. Yeah.
Yeah. But you see, that highlighted one very important aspect when it comes to our societal resilience. Right?
Yeah.
That I think that was one major incident that impressed upon us that we need to assert our national identity.
Right.
That's why after that, for example, on various occasions when the ruling PAP, when they have party delegations going to China or official government delegations going to China, they make sure that the makeup of delegation is multiracial,
Of course.
just
Yeah.
to impress upon our Chinese
The
folks
Singapore is distinct,
that we're distinct. We have
which is true. Which is
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, for example, the current Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he has dealt with Vivian Balakrishnan for a long time. So,
Forever. Yeah.
he knows that he is not Chinese anyway,
Yeah.
right? But I remember my interlocutor from China, who is also an academic, he reminded me this. Look, Colin, the Chinese policy elites in Zhongnanhai will understand. They know.
But not the
But not necessarily
right.
the average Chinese people,
Yeah.
right? So in a way, I will also have to say that the Chinese government is also playing a very precarious
Yeah.
position, trying to bridge the foreign policy needs and
With domestic
needs.
messaging.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in a way, because if say the domestic audience asks, Singapore is majority Chinese, and why
Yeah.
wouldn't they support us on the South China Sea issue?
Right. Right.
And if you are the CCP, right, how are you going to answer that?
Yeah.
So that is a very tricky question to answer.
Very, and I don't envy the position of the Chinese government, but I think we should also envy the position of Philippine government nowadays, which is
Yes.
taking a very tough stance. Now, I don't want to put you in this position of the pontificating Singaporean telling the rest of us and what. I know you're not that guy, and
I'm not.
that's one of the reasons
I hope not.
and in fairness, I mean, I think nowadays you talk to a lot of our Singaporean friends at the highest levels. They're very clear. No, no, no. We're not here to lecture anyone,
Yeah.
right?
We are
I
very
know
happy.
everyone looks at Singapore as such a but no, we're just a city state. We're a small
We are
country,
small.
etc. Yeah. So, in fairness, I appreciate that. um, but you have been one of the persons for the purpose of our audience who know a lot about Singapore but don't know about their own country's navy, right? I mean, this is the irony I noticed. Everyone loves Singapore, talks about. Do you even know what's going on in the Philippines? Can you tell them what's going on in the Philippines and what else should be done down the road?
Yes. I think the armed forces of the Philippines, and by extension the Philippine Coast Guard, face a very tricky scenario here, which is that much of the equipment face or has been subjected to what we call block obsolescence, right? Because
Right.
if you think about it, many years ago, in the 60s, 70s, the Philippine Navy was one of the strongest Southeast
Yeah.
Asian Navy.
Absolutely.
And it inherited much of the assets from the US Navy, and even those assets that served in the Vietnam War, for example, they were
Right.
passed over to the Philippine Navy. The Philippine Navy was strong. It was the Philippine Navy's golden age. But over the years, the relative neglect sort of led to the disrepair
And
of the
domestic
fleet.
insurgency, army
Yeah.
dominating.
Yes.
Yeah.
The threat perception was inward looking, then
Yeah.
outward looking. That situation persisted into the 1990s, even all the way into the 2000s.
Yeah.
Right? And the awakening came with the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident. I think that was the first reawakening. One will argue the first reawakening ought to be the Mischief Reef.
Yeah, 1990s essentially,
Yeah.
1994, 1995. Yeah.
Yes, but back then the messaging done internally wasn't done effectively, right? And also because back then the priority is still internal security.
Yeah.
So Mischief Reef sort of gone into the history books as okay, so one reef lost.
And also, to be fair, the U.S. had just exited the Philippines
Yes.
in terms of military bases, so
Yes.
the Philippines could afford back in the day to outsource it to the U.S. because U.S. bases were here.
Yes.
But in 1992, they were getting out.
Yes.
So I think there was this very difficult transition period
Yeah.
and supposed wake up call. But just to be fair, the Ramos administration, which I think was the most astute, and I talked to President Ramos on many occasions, they said we wanted to improve things, and then the Asian financial crisis hit the Philippines.
Yes.
And suddenly we don't have money. We were supposed to get F-18 Hornets
Yes.
in mid-1990s, and we had to scrap that. So for a while, we didn't even have supersonic fighter jets. So you're absolutely right that into the 2010s, things changed, and the Scarborough Shoal crisis really made it. But to be fair, it was also in 2011 that President Aquino pushed for AFP modernization. So now, can you explain to our audience, how are you looking at this improvement? Yeah.
By the way, during the time when I think Ramos was the president, there was some proposal to get, for example, warships from Russia even. So back then, the government...
He
if I'm not
visited
wrong,
Russia, I think, once. Yeah.
there was the desire to build up
Interesting.
capabilities, even if you are not getting it from traditional sources. But it does reflect the resolve to try to build up and beef up things, right? So back then, things were a completely different type of situation, right? A different threat perception, funding situation is very different, and the priorities are completely different from administration to administration. Things started to change, I think, after 2012.
Yeah.
And even that takes a lot of time. Now, to be fair, even with the US exit from the Philippines back then in the early 1990s, you couldn't do much in that window up to the time when Mischief Reef incident happened, right? That was 1994, right? It was just a 4-year window. And honestly, you can't do much in 4 years to build up a military that could effectively deter a much bigger power in the neighborhood. So in a way, one will argue that maybe the transition is not done in a very effective way, such that the withdrawal of US forces should have been done in a phased manner.
Yes, yes.
To the point that it allows the AFP to build up sufficiently before a complete withdrawal of the US forces. So maybe on hindsight, that could have been a better way to do
I'm
it.
looking at Afghanistan. I'm saying, never surprised with the Americans not doing the face out well. It's a
Yeah,
British American tradition, I would say. Even the
yeah,
British, their withdrawal from South Asia,
yeah,
and all of that. So,
yeah.
where do you think the Philippines is today with the transparency initiative? You're one of the first and few folks who highlighted the importance of transparency
Mm.
initiative. But I think everyone knows that transparency alone and reputational risk raising alone doesn't work. So, what should be the next step for
Mm.
the Philippines? Yeah.
Yes, I think transparency is an ongoing long-term strategy. Uh, it has to go on, right?
Yeah.
My question has always been, what's next?
What's next?
As you highlighted, right? You have put out all the videos, the images. You held the press conferences. You have Commodore J who will put out the tweets in almost real-time basis to educate and to create public awareness, not just in the Philippines but across the region and
Absolutely.
elsewhere,
Yeah.
right? And of course, it puts China on the back foot. It surprised China initially, but I guess it reached a point where the Chinese decided, okay, just hack it.
Yeah.
I don't care anymore, right?
Yeah.
Everyone is just saying that I'm wrong anyway, right? So you're just
Yeah.
going to keep doing what I'm doing, right? And not care about reputation. So then the question is, you could continue to do all that, but at one point of time, something has to give, right? Then the question is, do you think you need to do more when it comes to not just building your own armed forces and your coast guard? So meaning, even as you have transparency, you're putting the real stuff on the ground.
Right.
And by that, I mean you need to be very, very careful and very precise in how you strategize the procurement. And that, I think, goes back, I think, our earlier discussion. I remember when we had this Zoom discussion,
Yeah.
that the Armed Forces Act, right, is something that always intrigued me. Because if you look at the AFP Act closely, it seems to say that the AFP is mandated to do everything across the board. Then the question is, if the AFP is supposed to do everything, then how do you divide the responsibilities
With
with
Coast
the
Guard and
Coast Guard?
others, yeah.
Yeah. Who should take the lead, for example? I mean, the NTF WPS is a very good initiative where the Coast Guard takes the lead in that. I think that is very helpful. And in a sense, it also means that AFP now is taking on a much more primary role of just simply archipelagic defense, right? CADC, external defense. And by that, one will argue that that still ties in with the West Philippine Sea, right?
Right.
And in a way, it still overlaps with the Coast Guard activities that will be undertaken. So the way I see it is, there must be a way to further harmonize the various agencies. I think that's important. More interagency collaboration, which you are seeing already, I think more could be done, of course. But I think what is more important is you couldn't do many things without the capacity. So it means that if it's a real Horizon 3, if there's a need to have Horizon 4, 5, for example, it has
What
been
are the
ongoing
things
for-
you have to focus on in submarine capability? Do you think is reasonable considering you're looking at the shelf life 5 to 10 years?
Look, I know submarine is very sexy. And of course, given
Yeah.
the Philippines' archipelagic geography,
Yeah.
submarines are very useful. Then the issue here is, I'm not against the idea of submarines. In fact, if you know what I have been working
Yes,
on,
of
there were
course.
submarines. And I believe that the Philippines' maritime geography necessitates the use of submarines. Then the question is, how do you prioritize?
Yeah.
What is the most needed now and what is the least needed for now that you can
Right.
plan for later? What I believe
Important and urgent, kind of.
for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
urgent
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
right? So what I believe as to be the most urgent right now is the ability to show visible presence.
Right.
So I give the example of Sabina Shaw or Escoda Shaw, right? Escoda Shaw. The Teresa Mabanoa is just one of the two
100
OPVs.
meter. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If you add the Gabriela Silang, right, that's just three. In theory, you could only have one such ship out there
Yeah.
at sea. That is just not sufficient. You need that. So if, say for example, there has been much greater capacity, then maybe there is no need to withdraw the ship back then, right? I mean, in early September, if I
You're talking
get
about
it correct.
smaller ships, more numerous ships. What are you looking at here?
Bigger ones.
Oh, you want even bigger ones?
offshore patrol vessel.
Offshore patrol vessels.
Yes,
Yeah.
the size of that OPV that was sent.
Right, by China.
Yes. I mean, it doesn't have to match what China is fielding. There's no need to have a 10,000 ton
Yeah.
offshore patrol vessel because even the Chinese were complaining that it's very expensive
Right.
to
right.
operate. So what I'm referring to will be, OPVs that is at least 1,000 ton and above.
Yeah.
Enough for you to be on station out there for as long as possible.
So just enough number of those good stuff.
Yes.
And that could make a lot of difference before the submarines and fancy stuff come in. Yeah.
So surface ships.
Surface ships, yeah.
Surface ships like corvettes, like frigates, OPVs. I think all these are important when it comes to the current needs. Submarine is good, but it serves largely the purpose of deterrence.
Right.
Right. And then some will argue that you need it now because you need to deter China now.
Yeah.
Then the
But
question,
it'll take you 10 years before.
exactly. And furthermore, I mean, China has its own submarine fleet,
Yeah.
and it has its own anti-submarine capabilities.
Yep.
So I do question, if you do not plan for it in the long term and with a more concerted manner,
Yeah.
it's not going to convince the Chinese that you mean business, right?
Right.
They will know, okay, yeah, you get submarine now, but they will doubt whether you are able to operate it past 5 years or 10 years.
Right.
You get it now and you will be in port forever. You will never get out to the sea, for example. So for the Chinese, I think that must be a way to convince them more effectively. And to do that, you have to do that by demonstrating the ability to plan coherently in the long term, to show that you mean business. You're not buying things out of say, our whims and fancies.
For symbolic reasons. Yeah.
So I think one example that I believe could be learned from would be Vietnam. Vietnam has planned its maritime forces build up in a very deliberate manner. It didn't get submarines at the beginning.
Yeah.
It started small. So it started getting 2 mini subs from North Korea, use them for largely special forces training, as well as to give them a very basic submarine capability. And from then, they sort of build up, and then gradually they buy their real submarines. 6 of them, not just one.
Yep.
6 of them. It's a working fleet.
Russian Kilo class, pretty
Kilo
advanced
class,
ones, yeah.
636.3. That is one of their later subversions. The Chinese will pay notice that, this is not a force that was created or being procured for, say, prestige reasons, right? It's a force that is meant for warfighting. So I guess that approach might be useful to show that you are serious in that. It has been a long-term defense procurement approach, one that is also synchronized with the other relevant agencies, like like the Philippine Coast Guard, BFAR, for example. I think with that, it is much effective in communicating your intent to China.
That you're serious people and have to be taken seriously. On that non-pontificating but very practical and good recommendation for our Singaporean guest, thank you very much, Colin, for this fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Richard.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.